At first light today, the search for clues resumed.
Today, detectives launched a full-scale murder hunt involving 40...
Each year, there are over 500 murders in Britain.
The body was found just after 7 this
Police
morning.
are becoming increasingly concerned about the disappearance of a young mother.
Murdered in her bed at home by a man.
Every one is a tragedy, sending shockwaves through families and communities.
You know, the old saying, people go white with fear, if you like. But that's what happened.
But some murders have an impact that no one could have predicted.
Did you kill Julie Hogg? Yes.
Sparking a chain of events that ripple far beyond.
It's only in later years can you realise how massive this step was.
Overturning old laws.
You both have rights. They broke all the rules.
This was indicative of the fact that there is something horribly wrong with the law.
Revolutionising crime detection.
Police say it's the most significant scientific advance in the fight against crime since fingerprinting.
We won't get the sample, but we'll flush him out.
And ultimately, changing the world we live in.
The judge here said after 15 years, justice had now finally been done.
In this episode, a hunt to find the killer of 2 teenage girls leads to a new science, DNA profiling.
You've got a great expectancy from the families. Promise me you'll catch my daughter's killer.
An advance that has convicted millions of perpetrators around the world and cracked cases that were, until then, impossible to solve.
Put the pressure on, something could crack, something could come to the surface, and it did.
In the heart of England is the county of Leicestershire. Across the M1 and a few miles from the city are 3 villages: Narborough, Enderby and Littlethorpe. In the 1980s, these were quiet, rural communities.
You had a newsagent, a cake shop. It was very, very proper old-fashioned village.
People kept to themselves, and it was sort of family orientated, really.
They were both traditional villages. Nothing that remarkable had ever happened in Narborough or Enderby that I can recall. And then something happened that really brought the 3 villages into focus for all the wrong reasons.
I worked for Royal Mail at that time, and I was on what you'd call the early shift. The manager came, says, "Oh, there's a phone call for you." And it was Lynn, and she just says, "You've got to come home." I said, "Well, I can't come home. I've only just started and I've got to do my round." She says, no, really, you need to come home. It's Linda." I thought, oh, crikey, what's she done? You know, she'd been hit by a car or something like that. And then she says, no, she's been murdered.
Body was found just after 7 this morning by a passer-by. It had been dumped here behind this fence. She may well have been using this path, which is a popular shortcut between the main Leicester to Coventry Road ahead and the village of Narborough to the right. Linda was preparing to take her O-levels at Lutterworth Grammar School.
She was a lovely girl, got a bright future.
She was a little tiny, petite little doll with a cheeky face. And she only had to look at you and she'd got you. She was very bright, with a cheeky face.
Linda left home at 7:15 last night. She told her mother and stepfather she was going to see friends in Enderby. And friends say she never went anywhere in the dark on her own. This time she did, and it proved faithful.
This is the coppice, and this is where Linda lived. No, it's just an ordinary council estate. The first thing that I heard was I received a phone call around about 8 o'clock in the morning to say that a body had been found.
The man who took charge of the investigation into Linda Mann's murder was Leicestershire-born detective David Baker.
This is the area where the body was found. I can see the scene as it was at that time. It never leaves you. It was fairly obvious that the girl had been raped and strangled. The location is a very little used footpath. It led very much to us thinking that it was somebody that knew the area and that was local.
How do you say something to Kath when she'd lost her daughter? Nothing you can say is ever going to make that right, is it?
The questions are, well, who, where, when?
The police family liaison officer was there trying to explain what she knew, which wasn't a lot.
It wasn't long before others in the village became aware that something dreadful had happened.
So just coming up on our left here now, you can see Lutterworth Grammar School. This is where I was at school in 1983, and this is where Linda was at school in 1983. I can kind of picture in my mind's eye with a donkey jacket. Mostly it's her smile and her laugh that I can picture. I don't think I'll ever forget school that day. Along the corridors, there were groups of my peers, just inconsolably crying on each other. And they said, Linda Mann has been killed. There was a real momentum to it at the start. I think we kind of felt that they would solve it quickly.
The majority of murders are carried out by someone known to the victim, so the police were quick to investigate and rule out Linda's family and friends.
Linda was wearing black plimsolls, blue denims, a donkey jacket and a mauve-coloured sweatshirt when she was attacked just half a mile from her home. Linda's mother urged witnesses to come forward.
If anybody knows anything or saw anything, they must come forward and help, because it can only happen again.
The police conducted house-to-house inquiries. Finding witnesses was the best chance they had of catching Linda's killer.
One house heard a scream, which was obviously Linda being assaulted and dragged down this path. But I mean, they only surmised it was youths playing about.
Convinced they were looking for a local man, to extend their appeal for witnesses, Baker made sure the case was well covered by the press.
A local paper, as the Leicester Mercury was, it was part of the community. National newspapers don't report on their church fetes and Cubs and Scouts and Brownies events, and we're there to report on everything. The story of a murder of a young girl comes in, you're always taken aback by it. As a journalist, I've never wished bad things to happen, but if they happen, and they happen on our patch, then I would do my damnedest to give them the best coverage that I could.
People in this village may well know the girl, and if they've seen her walking anywhere in the locality, then we would want to know.
David Baker headed up his detective force with a rod of iron, so he was the right man for the job, but crime detection in the 80s was not as easy as it would be today with computers. Everything was filed on index cards in filing cabinets. The police had some weapons in their armoury, of which fingerprinting was one, but that was 100 years old. It's fair to say that the tools they had at their disposal were blunt tools, yeah.
I mean, what we were hoping for was that somebody had seen something, but of course that never transpired.
With no witnesses, the police focused on their other main method of solving crime in the 1980s, looking for physical evidence. Baker's team continued to scour the area for anything the killer might have left behind.
At first light today, the search for clues resumed. 100 officers are now on the inquiry. A number of objects have been found and they've been taken away for forensic tests.
There's a fence and a gate at the bottom. A field area over to the right with some bushes where Linda was found. And she'd been dragged back into the longer grass where the murder had taken place.
Neil Bunny was one of the uniformed officers tasked with conducting the search.
Our job was to cut that down, pass it back to the checkers. Then you have a line of officers on all fours doing an actual fingertip search, looking for anything, any possible clues. Anything that you could find on the ground was bagged and tagged.
They were looking for any physical traces of the murderer: footprints, tyre marks, fingerprints on a drink can, a button torn off clothes, anything that could connect a suspect to the scene.
You would immediately take a cigarette, but obviously not to get the DNA from it because DNA wasn't available then. But if you had an embassy cigarette and you had a suspect who's got a packet of embassy, it's circumstantial evidence, which is all that you were operating on in those days, really. It wasn't a nice feeling to think that you were working in an area where somebody had been so brutally murdered and raped. It was not a nice feeling at all.
A week into the investigation, and the police still had no witnesses and no suspects, and nothing found at the scene held fingerprints. The only potentially useful physical evidence was semen found on Linda's body, which had been sent to the Forensic Science Service for blood group analysis. Dave and Becky Werrett were both scientists working there in the 1980s.
At the time of the Linda Mann case, a semen sample could tell you very little before DNA. What you could get was a blood group, which I think everybody is familiar with. You're either A, B, AB, or O, which is the most common.
The problem was, it's not very discriminating.
It was almost more powerful at eliminating suspects than it was at including suspects.
2 weeks later, Baker got the results back from the lab. Linda's killer was blood group A, shared by 1 in 3 people. This could help rule a suspect in or out of the inquiry, but only if they had a suspect.
You're looking at 30% of the population, which is a lot of people. It doesn't take your inquiry any further.
Leicestershire police are no nearer to finding the killer. They've followed up more than 2,000 leads and taken 1,000 statements. The street corners where youngsters used to hang out are deserted. The chip shop has experienced a dramatic drop in sales. Villagers say they won't be able to rest until an arrest is made.
I was 13 at the time when Linda was murdered. I was quite sheltered, so I wasn't accustomed to the word murder or rape. You know, the whole thing of the not knowing who it was and if the person was still out there. It was a really confusing time, very frightening time.
Fear was tangible. One of their own had been taken. If this had happened to Linda, it could happen to anybody.
On the 2nd of February 1984, the police released Linda's body so her family could bury her.
Linda's mother and stepfather led the mourners, and sister Susan behind them.
My mum and dad went to Linda's funeral, and my mum said she just remembers it being absolutely packed. She remembers the police being there because they hoped whoever
the murderer
was
might even be there.
Yeah, they thought it might show up.
It was an incredibly scary time.
Filming Linda's funeral was a desperate measure, but produced no new leads. 12 weeks after the investigation began, the police were no closer to catching her killer.
I was angry that we hadn't managed to catch somebody. You think, well, I'm sure we did everything we could, but it's not there. There's been insufficient witnesses, of insufficient evidence to feel a collar.
Detective Inspector got in touch with Kath and said, really struggling, we've exhausted every avenue.
We just thought we'd never know what happened to her.
When you get to an inquiry and it's going dead, then you start to think, is it a lone incident? Is it local or isn't it? It's always in your mind that the perpetrator could be somebody that's just passing through.
Narborough is only a few miles away from what used to be the largest junction, which was at Crick, which was a huge stop-off for trucks. So you used to get truckers coming from all over the country and staying overnight there. Maybe it wasn't one of us, or it wasn't somebody that was known to us. This person had probably just passed through, done the deed, and off they went, and it would be harder to catch them.
In the early 1980s, police forces were struggling with other unsolved murders of women and girls.
Linda Mann murdered Monday, November the 21st. Colette Aram killed Sunday, October the 30th. Caroline Osborne murdered Friday, July the 29th. And Caroline Hogg killed sometime in early July. 4 faces, reflecting a growing trend in undetected murders. Concern grows over the rise in attacks on women and young girls.
Police have launched a murder inquiry after the body of 14-year-old Lisa Hessian was found in an alley near her home in Lee, near Manchester.
Yanulayani was just 17 years old when she was raped and murdered in her bed at home by a man she'd opened the door to and who then forced his way into the house.
Melanie Rhodes' body was found in St Stephen's Court at 5:45 on Saturday morning, just a few hundred yards from her parents' house. It was discovered by the local milkman and his 10-year-old son, who had already found some blood-stained clothing. Her body had been repeatedly and savagely stabbed.
Even when there was significant forensic evidence, like the trail of blood at the crime scene in the Melanie Road case, the police struggled to catch the killers.
In the 80s, it was very common for murders of females to be undetected. The victim is picked upon because they are alone and easily got at. And of course there's no witnesses. Very difficult.
This year alone, 262 have been killed, 50 aged 16 or under. Police forces, although equipped with the very latest technology, are struggling to find their murderers. Their cases unsolved, their killers still at large.
Two years had passed since Linda Mann's murder, and life for many in Narborough was slowly getting back to normal.
Time had moved on, and whilst Linda was always there in the back of my mind, you know, the strong emotions and memories around that had started to fade a little. So when I saw the news item about Dawn, I can remember saying, "Oh my God, it's happening again."
Dawn Ashworth, a friendly, pleasant, likeable schoolgirl. She lives with her parents and younger brother here at Enderby. Yesterday afternoon, she popped out to see friends. She did not return home. It's possible that she took a route close to a footpath known locally as the Black Pad, the spot where 3 years ago in November, the body of 15-year-old Linda Mann was found. Her killer is still at large.
As soon as Dawn's mum reported her missing, David Baker took charge of the search.
It caused concern straight away that the worst could have happened, especially after 24 hours when, you know, there was no trace of her.
I went through my school years with Dawn. We had classes together. Definitely a character. She could always make people laugh, and she had a great sense of humour. I went on a holiday. We'd only been there a few days, I think, and one of the guys that we were away with had gone to get a paper, and on the front of the paper was Dawn's face saying "missing girl." And I just remember going, "No, please." And I just had a real sinking feeling that I knew they weren't going to find her.
72 hours after she was reported missing, Dawn's body was found.
Now, this is £10 Lane, but it wasn't like this in 1986. It was a very narrow dirt road. Now, when I arrived, when we went into the field, over on the right-hand side under the hedge was where the body was.
Like Linda, Dawn had been raped and strangled. The house-to-house hunt for witnesses, the fingertip search for evidence, had to begin all over again. The pathologist found semen, which once again proved to be blood group A. Lynn Garner is best friends with Dawn's mum, Barbara.
Barbara's a very dear friend. It's difficult
for her to speak about Dawn. So I wanted to do it for her and for Dawn. It's a picture I took. The boys were playing in the back, hunting frogs, and me, Barbara and Dawn had time together, and it was lovely. She was growing up into a lovely young girl, pretty and clever and just kind. I can remember when the news broke that they'd found her. I rang Barbara and the police were there. You just, what do you say? How can you say anything?
I haven't seen this front page for decades, but the image of Dawn is as fresh in my mind today as it was then. That image of her and of Linda will never leave my mind. They just looked such sweet, fresh, innocent girls with their whole lives ahead of them.
We used to have the paper delivered then, and it landed on the doormat, and I just picked it, and I couldn't believe what I was reading about Dawn. And it was our worst fear. We had this fear for 3 years that whoever had done this would strike again.
Dawn and Linda's bodies had been found less than a mile from each other. All thoughts the killer might be someone passing through were gone.
Village newsagent proclaims the headline. Everyone here, though, knows the story. People in the neighbouring villages of Narborough and Enderby are frightened.
He is someone that is part of this community, whether he lives there, whether he works there, whether he visits there for social or other activities. He is within this community.
It hit everybody. Surely it's local. You know, nobody expects the child to be going out just a shortcut and to be killed like that on a sunny afternoon. Somebody knew the paths.
Well, everybody, as I say, very, very worried, and you're just looking round to think, you know, who could it be?
It could be a next-door neighbour or somebody, you know, round the corner from where you live.
I'm scared. I'm just the same as anyone else.
This time, the police found witnesses. Several people came forward saying they'd seen a motorbike parked under the bridge not far from where Dawn's body was found. It belonged to 17-year-old local kitchen porter, Richard Buckland.
We made inquiries concerning Buckland, and he was arrested. He was a vulnerable young person, but during the course of the interview, Buckland made certain admissions, and he couldn't explain why his bike was there and where he was. So circumstantially, there was a lot of evidence against him.
When he was tested, Buckland's blood group was type A.
When Leicestershire police arrested Richard Buckland, they were 300% certain, as Dave Baker told a press conference at the time, they had the right man.
When you hear that the police had got somebody, we thought that's it.
It was finally the end, almost. And then, unfortunately, it wasn't.
Even though the witness statements and forensics seemed to stack up, the case against Richard Buckland wasn't completely clear-cut.
We were in very little doubt that he was responsible for the murder of Dawn Ashworth. But we questioned him in connection with Linda Mann, and he denied all responsibility.
Convinced Buckland had killed Linda too, Baker needed something concrete to connect him to both crimes. Then he remembered something he'd read.
There was an article in the Leicester Mercury, which I'd read some time previously, which stuck in my mind.
The article, from November 1985, reported on a new DNA identity test that had been developed by a scientist just 5 miles from Narborough at Leicester University.
This was a local paper reporting on a local academic doing some good work, which it probably wouldn't have reported on had Dr. Jeffries been based at another university, which was being read by the man at the head of the investigation into the two murders.
The scientist called his new technique DNA fingerprinting. It had been used for the first time to prove that a boy trying to re-enter Britain from Ghana to join his mother was indeed her child.
It stuck in my mind that this was like a fingerprint for an individual. It made me aware of the possibilities of DNA.
DNA had first been discovered in 1953, spawning a whole new field of science. In 1977, Alec Jeffreys joined Leicester University's Department of Genetics.
Our first mission was try and look at human DNA and start looking at how it varied from one person to another, but with very clear view in mind that anything we could come up with could have an impact on medical genetics. So no thoughts of forensics, not at the beginning, absolutely not.
In September 1984, Jeffreys stumbled on a way to produce a visual representation of the differences between one person's DNA and another's.
We start off with a blood sample, or it could be a semen sample, and from that we can chemically extract the DNA. That DNA is then reacted to highlight those bits of the DNA which vary a lot from one person to the next. At the end of the procedure, we get a pattern on X-ray film, which consists of a series of bands or stripes, rather like a barcode on a library ticket. And it's that pattern which we call the genetic fingerprint. So we can use it for not only individual identification, but also for establishing family relationships.
We got that first DNA fingerprint first, and then within minutes we're thinking forensics, paternity testing, really exciting stuff.
Baker hoped this new technique might prove the semen found on the bodies of both Linda and Dawn had definitely come from Richard Buckland.
We rang Alec Jeffrey up and asked if he could do a test using the samples from the two girls.
The murders of Linda and Dawn, and the arrest of a local man whose guilt needed proof, had led David Baker to Alec Jeffrey's experimental technique. The results would transform criminal justice forever.
What an extraordinary case to be asked to become involved with, right at the beginning of the DNA story. The samples arrived in the laboratory. The job was simply confirm what they knew already, which he was guilty of the second murder, and to try and tie him into the first. So we did the DNA analysis with the greatest of trepidation. Nobody had ever attempted anything like this before, and the results were pretty dramatic.
This is the genetic pattern of the first victim, Linda Mann, and as expected we see her two genetic characters. This is a forensic specimen containing semen from that first victim. We can see her two characters in it because it contains some of her material. Also two additional semen characters. If we now move to the second victim, that's Dawn Ashworth, the amounts of genetic material were tiny, but nevertheless we can see within these samples two genetic characters which are not attributable to the victim, which must therefore have come from the semen of the assailant. We therefore conclude that both girls have been sexually assaulted and therefore presumably murdered by the same individual. The second very important point is that was Richard Buckland really the murderer? This is his pattern, taken from his blood, and we can see immediately that that pattern is totally different from the semen pattern of the assailant in both Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth murder.
I do remember phoning up at this colleague of David Baker's and saying it looks as if the same man has indeed raped both of these girls, but it's not your man in custody. The police response down the phone was, shall we say, fairly violently Anglo-Saxon.
When we first got the results from Alec Jeffrey, it goes through your mind, is the science correct?
Well, I'll tell you one person who didn't believe the results, that was me. They were so convinced I got the right person. That result really worried me. I mean, I thought, okay, there is something fundamentally wrong with the science that we're doing here. The implications of that result were of enormous importance. We had to get it right.
Baker asked David Werrett from the Forensic Science Service to double-check the result.
They were at a quandary. They were right at the forefront and on the cutting edge of DNA. And as a consequence, they didn't know whether to doubt it or not. Once we had repeated the results, I needed to brief David Baker on what we had found.
It was really the forensic scientists who said, no, this is the result is genuine. There is no explanation other than this man is not guilty.
The Crown prosecution have decided that the proceedings against Mr. Buckland shall be discontinued. The results of the tests indicate that a person, as yet unknown, was involved in the deaths of the two girls.
Knowing somebody wasn't going to be put on trial for something they didn't do was a brilliant, brilliant thing, but it still left open the fact that there was somebody out there who did do it and who could do it again.
All the balls were back in the air and people were back to square one in terms of their emotions, their fears. It was almost worse than it had been before because that relief had now been replaced by anguish.
To know there was somebody else out there, and it could be anybody, and they've got to try and find this needle in a haystack, well, it seemed almost impossible to me.
All eyes were on David Baker to see what he would do next.
There must have been an awful amount of pressure on his shoulders. Pressure from the public, pressure from the press, but he's also under pressure from the families. He's got a great expectancy from the families to catch my daughter's killer. I'm looking at you, you promise me you'll catch my daughter's killer.
We were well aware that we got a serial killer. There was more brutality involved in Dawn's murder. To me, there was an escalation of what he was doing and that he would do it again. You've got to do something different.
What Baker set out to do next had never been attempted before.
I decided we would take blood samples from the male population in Enderby, Narborough and Littlethorpe with a view to finding the person responsible.
OK, look, we've got the DNA fingerprints of the unknown assailant. We're pretty sure is a local person. So what we can do is to throw out a dragnet out into the community, get as many people typed as possible, giving blood samples, and see if we can identify the perpetrator.
The fact the two girls had been murdered in close proximity, and knowing they were looking for a local man, the police were able to focus their search on a contained catchment area.
We were fortunate that the villages are so close together that we were able to do this. Had it been 5 miles down the road and in the city, it had been a totally different situation.
This week, all the young men in Enderby between the ages of 18 and 34 are receiving a letter requesting them to give blood samples.
The number of men in the area who were in the age group the police considered most sexually active was 5,000. Jeffries taught the team at the Forensic Science Service his technique, and they undertook the work of processing the samples.
For me at the time, it was a huge venture. As much of a breakthrough as it was, the technique of DNA fingerprinting is very labour-intensive. It took days to actually carry out the technique. So suddenly this little research unit was faced with this huge case of hundreds of samples coming in. It was exciting times, it was exhilarating, but it was 7 days a week.
Under careful supervision to prevent identity mix-ups, they've been registering to give blood samples. Each will then be checked to see if his genetic fingerprint matches that of the killer.
We didn't really understand DNA. Well, nobody knew what it was, really. Nobody understood about it. But they were just glad there was something else we could do instead of just waiting and praying that nobody else got murdered.
The incident room at Enderby is now working overtime, processing the results. Each blue form is a negative test result. The details are fed into the computer. One by one, the men are eliminated from the inquiry.
By May 1987, 4 months into the screening, the blood of 2,000 local men had been taken, but it hadn't yet unearthed the killer.
There are no intentions to end the inquiry. The aim is to carry on until the killer is caught. They know time is running out. Their constant fear is that the schoolgirl killer could strike again.
We hoped we would get the sample, although David Baker did say to me at the time that, well, you won't get the sample, but we'll flush him out.
The police, I just imagine, they think, put the pressure on, something will crack, something will come to the surface, and it did.
7 months after the screening started, a local bakery had a work night out in the Clarendon pub. The conversation turned to the mass screening, and someone said he'd been persuaded by a colleague to take his DNA test for him.
A woman heard this conversation, thought about it, and she realised the significance of and importance of what she'd overheard.
Early in the morning of the 19th of September 1987, the man who had evaded the DNA test was arrested at his home. He lived in the village of Littlethorpe, less than a mile from where Dawn and Linda had been murdered. His name was Colin Pitchfork.
Colin Pitchfork became the 4,853rd person to be tested.
The DNA came back positive, and there was no argument about it.
Inspector Baker rang my sister and said, "We've got him."
It had to be him. It couldn't be anybody else. There was going to be no mistake. It was him.
Good evening. A man is to appear in court in Leicester tomorrow, charged with the murder of two 15-year-old girls.
There was tight security as a crowd gathered outside Leicester Magistrates' Court. The man was hurriedly driven past...
It was a great relief. It was a conclusion to a very hard and difficult case. I'm firmly of the view that he would have committed another murder had he not been caught.
Colin Pitchfork showed no emotion as the charges were read. But on November the 21st, 1983, he murdered Linda Rosemary Mann. And on July the 31st, 1986, he murdered Dawn Amanda Ashworth. Women jeered and chanted abuse as he was driven away.
You look back and you realise there was just a coming together of circumstances. Alec Jeffreys discovering the technique with his team at Leicester University, the head of the county's CID believing in Alec Jeffreys and his discovery and putting his own job on the line almost in a way to test that out for the first time ever. It's only in later years you look back and you realise how massive this step was.
Genetic fingerprinting, known as DNA, was the key which finally unlocked the region's most confounding murder mysteries. DNA was first used in the Ashworth Mann murder hunt.
The Narborough case was finally closed. But for DNA profiling, this was just the beginning.
Once we'd circulated the information about DNA sampling, it went around police forces like wildfire.
That case in Narborough proved several points in one fell swoop, that the elimination process of people, the exoneration of innocence, and so on. And once it started to demonstrate itself, yes, the demand for casework was huge.
The screening in Narborough had also demonstrated something else: the potential to collect DNA profiles and store them on a computer database. If that process could be scaled up, they could create a national DNA database. But Jeffrey's technique, though it had inspired the idea, was actually an obstacle to delivering it.
It was very clear, as we were slaving away doing just a few hundred samples, that this could not be the technique we used to enable the National DNA Database. But we had moved on. We were on to DNA now, so whatever we could do in the future, it had to be DNA, and if we could get a technique that we could carry out that kind of thing with, that was the dream that we had.
Werrett's colleague Peter Gill was part of the team given the job of developing a new technique fit for a DNA database.
The technique that we were using was still quite primitive compared with today's methodology. It would take us around a week or maybe even 2 weeks to process a sample. And we had to look at all of the DNA profiles by eye.
The new method depended on two key innovations. The first was to automate the process of comparing and storing DNA profiles.
What we can do with these DNA profiles is we can turn them into a series of digits, rather like a lottery code or lottery number. Once you've developed the technology to actually produce these digits, it's actually quite simple to store them in a computer and then to carry out the searches.
Samples taken from crime scenes are often small and degraded, so they also devised a way to multiply DNA, making it possible to work with even the tiniest samples.
The amplification technique basically amplified the amount of DNA that we had. That's the bottom line. Saliva from the end of a cigarette, small semen samples, and it enabled you to effectively grow that DNA to the point where you could get a good result from it. That was what we knew would be the game changer of forensic science.
Then in 1993, 7 years after the first use of DNA fingerprinting, they got a chance to put their prototype technique to a very public test.
Tsar Nicholas II and his family were killed by the Bolsheviks in 1918 following the Russian Revolution, but their whereabouts remained a mystery until the discovery of human bones in a burial pit in the Urals. Now, Home Office scientists at Aldermaston hope to use a method called genetic DNA profiling to establish that fact beyond doubt.
Scientists came to our laboratory with the bones in a carrier bag. The Romanov case engendered a huge amount of worldwide interest. This work had never been done before, so we had no clue whether it was going to work or not.
The first thing their new technique demonstrated was that it was possible to extract DNA from samples many decades old.
We are 98.5% certain that this is the Romanov family. The case was extremely important. It demonstrated the technique was on the right track for a national DNA database.
The technology first used to help catch a killer in Leicestershire had evolved and answered a decades-old murder mystery. Now, under the spotlight of the world's press, the pressure was on to deliver the first ever national DNA database.
The ambition was to get the machinery working and process the samples at a rate that they were coming in at. Now, the instrumentation itself was at a testing stage. So we had the prototypes for the instrumentation. We had a mix of chemicals that we were putting together, which in itself was a prototype, and we had no one to do the technique, so we had to train them.
We were recruiting 200 to 300 people at a time.
It was a great thing to be part of, and the speed of movement was fantastic.
By 1994, a DNA database was technically possible, but it raised new and important ethical questions, and final approval rested with the then Home Secretary.
When I got to the Home Office, I was presented with a graph by the officials, and they said, Home Secretary, this is what's happened to crime over the last 50 years. As you can see, it's gone up by an average of 5% a year, and the first thing you must understand is that there's nothing you can do about it. When I became aware of what the DNA database could do, I became quite excited.
This is an immensely exciting prospect. We are leading the world in the use of this technology. It's going to be of immense help in the fight against crime.
But this was a new thing, it was an innovation. So there were people who thought that taking a DNA sample from someone infringed their personal liberty. I must confess that it was not an argument that I ever had much sympathy with.
The world's first national DNA database comes into operation in Britain today. Police say it's the most significant scientific advance in the fight against crime since fingerprinting.
From today, the police have wider powers to take body samples and see if the DNA, or genetic fingerprint, matches that found at the scene of a crime.
Well, earlier I spoke to Andrew Puddifoot of Liberty, who told me why his organisation is opposed to the introduction of DNA sampling.
The proposals today are very dramatic. It will give the police the power to take DNA samples from anyone convicted or charged with a recordable offence, including not paying a fare when you get on a bus or a train. And I think to take such a broad range of DNA samples is really quite a dramatic and at this stage unwarranted move.
The ethical implications of the database would continue to be a cause for much debate. But once it launched, the aim was to load 135,000 profiles by the end of the year. This would include profiles from samples found at the scenes of unsolved crimes.
The DNA record will be kept on this database in Birmingham, a useful weapon for detecting sex offenders, for example, who frequently begin by committing relatively minor crimes.
I remember the database had been launched in a matter of months, I think, when we had a hit of an individual who caused a fracas at a petrol station. That individual was arrested, a sample was taken from him, and he matched an undetected rape, which was a huge breakthrough.
The work with the Romanov bones had proved that a DNA profile could be retrieved from very old evidence. This meant the database could also offer hope in long unsolved murders, so-called cold cases.
All these files relate to pretty much murders. Most of them are solved murders. This far end is cold case. Now, they date back to the 1940s. There are also 20 or 30 stranger rape offences down there, undetected. The reason I opened this particular one is because these are the boxes for Operation Rhodium to do with the Melanie Road case.
Melanie was killed only a few yards from here, her home in a quiet cul-de-sac. Even today, her parents are still too upset to talk about their daughter's murder.
17-year-old Melanie Road had been raped and murdered in Bath in 1984, the year between the murders of Linda and Dawn in Leicestershire.
Well, this is St Stephen's Court, where Melanie's body was found. And on this wall was her keys with a little name tag that said Melanie on it.
As with so many stranger rapes and murders, the police found no witnesses. They did have extensive forensic evidence, both blood and semen from the crime scene.
It appeared on the surface to be a lot of evidence, but wouldn't have mattered how many blood spots there were, it still wasn't telling us who the offender was back in 1984.
But because the evidence had been safely stored, 10 years later, it could be re-examined.
As soon as the database launched in 1995, a decision was made to review the Melanie Road case. That decision was made because of DNA. We contacted the Forensic Science Service, and miraculously, they had remnants of the swabs, bits of the victim's trousers, and they got a full DNA profile. When it got loaded on the database, we were hoping it's a matter of waiting a week or so and we'll be given the name of our offender. But that didn't happen. The offender was not on the national database.
All they could do now was keep the killer's profile in the system and wait. If he was arrested for another offence of any kind, he would be caught. Over the next few years, as the database expanded, the hit rate increased. In 1998, almost a third of new offender profiles were matched to DNA found at crime scenes. This success was inspiring other countries to follow suit.
The law also allows police to store the blood of convicted offenders on a database.
Soon there were databases in New Zealand, Austria, the United States, Germany, the Netherlands, and Slovenia.
People are flooding from all over the world to see how we in Britain do it.
By 2003, there was another development in DNA technology called familial searching that further enhanced the power of the database. It was used for the first time in the hunt for the killer of 87-year-old Gladys Godfrey.
The judge described this as a truly horrendous crime. Gladys Godfrey was raped and then strangled.
DNA found at the scene didn't match anyone on the database. But a familial search meant they could look not just for direct matches, but for anyone whose DNA was similar enough to the profile that they could be a relative of the perpetrator.
It was intelligence-led policing. we're giving police forces a list of names, we're giving them intelligence, then they would obviously use their powers of investigation to narrow the list down further.
After investigating the long list of potential relatives, they found a connection to Gladys Godfrey's killer. It would be the very first time a familial DNA search was used to catch a murderer. In Bath, the man responsible for the murder of Melanie Road still hadn't been caught. By 2009, his DNA profile had been on the database for 14 years without a match, when a new detective joined the cold case review team for Avon and Somerset Police.
When I was working on this case, I was convinced that it was solvable. We've got a full DNA profile, which is just incredible. Not many cases have those. There was never any doubt in my mind that we were going to find the person responsible.
McKay's first move was to request a familial search of the database.
We only needed one relative to have had their DNA taken and be put on that database to give us a clue.
They got back a list of hundreds of names, but after investigating, none could be connected to Melanie's killer.
There was all sorts of a roller coaster ride, thinking we're going to get a hit and then not getting a hit.
Over the next few years, to make sure the killer wasn't already in their files, they re-examined the 8,000 names that had accumulated over decades of inquiries, eliminating them all on the basis of DNA. Then, still convinced DNA was the key, 30 years after Melanie's murder, McKay decided to try another familial search.
In 5 years, 1 million more names go on the database. The opportunity for your offender or a relative of them to be there now is huge.
This time, the list of people potentially related to the killer looked promising.
The top one on the list was what everyone described as a screamer. Her DNA is so much more like the crime scene than any other.
For the first time, we were starting to get excited. It's like, Gary, OK, then let's crack on, let's find out. And of course, so Gary did all the research on it.
The person who the DNA taken who'd been arrested for a criminal damage offence was born in Bath. So that added a little bit to the excitement, as you can imagine. And I found out that her father was born in Bath. That's what I wanted. And I spoke to him on his mobile. And I said that the reason I've spoken to him is his daughter's DNA happens to be similar to the crime scene, so I need to eliminate him. Goodness knows what must have been going through his mind.
Gary met him, took a swab, and sent it off to the lab for testing to find out if his DNA matched that left at the scene of Melanie's murder 30 years before.
So I was on holiday when the results came back. Gary got hold of me in the afternoon. He's like, Julie, we've got a hit.
It was phenomenal. A great, great moment.
And I just thought about Melanie. That's completely what came into my head. I can see it clear as day now. Melanie, we've done it for you. And that was my first thought then. We've actually done it for you.
Over the decades, 700 police officers have worked on the case, hoping that advances in science would one day identify the killer. Last year, a breakthrough. Scientists found that a DNA swab taken from a woman in an unrelated case was similar to DNA found at the scene. That new sample came from the daughter of this man, Christopher Hampton. 32 years later, he admitted murdering Melanie. Hampton was told he'll serve at least 22 years of his life sentence. Given he's now in his mid-60s, the judge said he may well die behind bars.
Before DNA profiling, stranger rapes and murders were by their nature almost impossible to solve. Now, it can help provide answers, even decades after the crime.
11-year-old Leslie Moleseed abducted, sexually assaulted and stabbed to death in 1975. Her killer was at large for 32 years before he was brought to
see him convicted was Leslie's family.
We are relieved our quest for justice for Leslie is now over.
And this week, DNA has led to a charge in the murder of 15-year-old Jacqueline Thomas, 46 years ago. 70-year-old Anthony Hall was questioned at the time of the murder in
Hutchinson, a murderer who had eluded police for 26 years. Colette Eram was his victim, 16 years old and training to be a hairdresser. Enough DNA was gathered to build up a genetic
Yanni was just 17 when she was raped and murdered in August 1982. A 34-year wait for justice finally over. Today, relief knowing the man who murdered their young family member will spend the rest of his life in prison.
Almost 40 years on from the Narborough investigation, with more than 70 million people on DNA databases around the world, the legacy of the murders of Linda and Dawn is immeasurable.
Very proud to say that served in the Leicestershire force and that we were at the forefront of DNA. Very, very proud of Dave Baker.
Looking back, I mean, this is a memorable part of my career. You know, I look at what I joined the police force for, and I mean, the DNA has been the crown on top of the career. You know, I'm proud to be part of it.
It's important that it is remembered that it started here. Sadly, it had to take 2 young lives for this set of circumstances to come together. No one should ever forget that.
But the lovely thing was Linda Mann's mum saying that, you know, we call this Linda's legacy. So, okay, DNA didn't help her, but in the future, maybe it'll do something. Of course it does.
Seven days ago, she'd have been 50, and we'd have been celebrating her 50th birthday.
Nobody will forget her. Nobody will forget her.
Barbara wanted to say something, but she didn't feel able to speak herself, so she's written a few words. Dawn was a wonderful daughter. She would talk to me about anything, and we shared countless treasured memories. Almost every week, she brought me flowers with wages from her Saturday job. Some were in the vase the day she went missing. Having given Dawn the gift of life, I think of her every day and what life would have had in store for her. Now, when I hear of a case where DNA has solved a crime, I look up to the heavens and say, there you are, Dawn. We've caught another one.
Next time.
Did you kill Julie Hogg? Yes.
A murder that went unpunished.
Why is he serving a 6-year sentence for lying and not a life sentence for taking the life of another human being?
And inspired one mother to challenge an 800-year-old law.
So you had a man who knew had killed your daughter, and he was walking free, bragging he'd killed her.
Want to find out more about policing, the law and its impact on society? Explore our interactive pages. Go to bbc.co.uk/crimes that changed us and follow the links to the Open University.